Okay, this is Friday. This is the meeting for the K8s Infra team. Soon to be work group, hopefully. We talked a little bit before reviewing the action items. I forgot to push the recording button, so let's start back up again. So Aaron, Tim, please.
Yeah, so I don't know, just to kind of recap on the working group thing a little fully, I brought it up to steering committee. Let's keep it non-controversial by saying whichever SIG it seems like we have prior art for them owning that code, that's the SIG that owns that code, but we can revisit as need be. So a subdirectory of k8s.io for DNS seems reasonable. If we need to spread other stuff other places, that's fine too. I am happy to work on a charter or work with somebody on a charter. I think the main thing is I want to get majority representation rule in there, try to keep things loose and informal, and do just enough to make sure we have the working group pieces of structure like a Zoom license and recurring meetings on a calendar and blah, 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 label we can apply to things. Yeah. And maybe at that point we can revisit whether or not we want to reschedule the meeting for something that's a little more world friendly and maybe avoiding Friday.
Yeah, definitely. So any other takers? Otherwise I can work with Aaron. Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, it's you and me, Aaron. Okay, so I'll let you start and I'll follow along and contribute. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
Because I'm not familiar with all the processes within the steering committee.
Don't worry, we're making it up as we go along. The first
Okay.
45 minutes of the meeting, we're trying to discuss that process. So we're going to see if we can float alongside that.
Okay, sounds good. So let's do that.
I'd like to tag along for that ride so I can learn the process as well.
Sure.
Sounds good, hippie hacker. Okay, then what was the next one? So working group, we already talked about that. So one idea that came up during the release cycle in 1.12 was we had a few things that needed a home where we could run those. For example, the publish bot is right now running inside Red Hat somewhere. And then there was this idea for a cherry pick bot that we've been debating on a PR, whether it's going to suck up tokens, number of times we can use and things like that. So does it make sense to create a utility cluster as a place where we can start experimenting with ACLs and running some of these bots and trying to get a handle on how we would give permissions for people to try things out, pull logs, and things like that?
I think that's the next logical step here. And it would be fine to let that proceed in parallel. I'm also happy to sort of dump state from the utility clusters that we have and the experiences we've had around running it if somebody wants to take up that mantle.
Well, I think a big problem with this is that one of the first things that we don't have is like a credential store.
Right. Right. The reason for picking on this one was that we are not in anybody's path, so to say. We are not like, this is like an independent effort just to stand up the infrastructure and try to see how how we can make things work outside of the Google infrastructure. But yeah, what do you use for credential sharing right now, Ben?
Right now we have
an internal tool.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we have our internal tool for sharing stuff internally. For the utility cluster, actually clusters plural, that we have running right now, we upload the credential to the cluster and we use RBAC and whatever to make sure that appropriate people have access to the cluster, and that's it.
Right. So would a simple private GitHub repository work in this case for now, or?
I mean, do we need a repository to check in credentials, or is it sufficient to say for each service account that we're creating, we upload the credential to the cluster and leave it running in live state. And if there's a problem, we recreate the credential.
I mean, so there's like you need like an email address and probably like two-factor tied to the account. I think those things may not be best tracked in a K8s secret. Like the actual token for the robot, that works great in a K8s secret, but all of the other things you need for the account, not quite so much.
Which accounts are we talking about here?
Well, like for example, for K8s CI robot, there is the GitHub account. There is a email address that backs the GitHub account. Both of those things have two-factor on them.
Sure. I was thinking about the Google Cloud service account credentials, but not thinking about GitHub, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Dims was getting at, like, for example, an account for a cherry pick robot. And to do that, I think we probably want to find some kind of like password sharing tool or something.
We run Vault in our cluster. Like this is an opportunity for us, honestly, to eat our dog food a little bit more and look at what people are doing. We have Cloud Key Store. I haven't used it myself, but maybe that's an option.
I mean, that was going to be my Google hat on suggestion. My Google hat off it sounds like this is what everybody uses Vault for.
Yeah.
I also agree with Dim's perspective that this is an opportunity to experiment, not necessarily find the one true way.
Right.
So like the cherry picking stuff does require a full-on Prow setup. Cherry picking is basically another Prow plugin. And Christoph, who's not here, has some specific concerns around the way the cherry picking bot works in the Red Hat repo, and why that may not work here in Kubernetes. But I think focusing on the publishing bot, like totally 100% agree.
Right. The cherry pick bot was more like the Fetchta bot, which is run outside of Prow, right? And it works like a regular bot, not as a Prow plugin.
I believe
it subscribes for notifications, but it is not part of Prow, is it?
It subscribes to them through Prow. I'm not sure if it works without Prow.
I see. Okay.
Yeah,
it might be though.
Perhaps this is a different bot entirely, but I saw an issue get opened up recently asking for /cherry pick foo to be able to cherry pick a branch foo, and there's code being merged into Prow for that. Red Hat just has that code enabled upstream. We do not.
Correct. And in the same discussion, there was like a sub discussion where should we run it as part of Prow or run it as a standalone thing? So I was trying to see if we can do the standalone thing.
Without going into too much detail, it runs as an external plugin, but I believe those still depend on, like, they hook up to the standard component and they tell them they exist and what their commands are and what kind of events they need and that sort of thing.
So
is the cherry picker or is the publishing robot something we can move?
Yes, publishing robot we can move right now.
Can we do that? And can we start experimenting with like credential management and things? I talked to them about this briefly and they said they used like a CNCF LastPass, but they had just sent a password once. It wasn't really in use.
Okay, that sounds perfect. So let's start with publish bot then.
So I'm all for starting to do this work. Scrolling back to the very top of this doc, I think we have a few things we need to do before we do that.
Okay.
Specifically, we need to put a little bit of thinking into how we're going to do spend reports. Like we will need to be able to document where we're spending all of the money. And that needs somebody to sit down and think about. I don't actually know the billing subsystem that well to figure out what reports are easy to generate and how we want to isolate. Like we have a Kubernetes public project. Do we throw a GKE cluster in there and use that? Or do we create a new project and create a cluster in that one?
I would really highly encourage at least splitting up projects. It not only makes it easier to pin down billing, it also helps with just isolation even beyond something like RBAC.
I mean, I have a sense that that's true. Somebody needs to at least like look at those options and write down a page about why we should do it? Like, are you signing up for that?
I can at least write a page on why using a project for all of the things has been awful for test infra, and we have avoided.
That would be great. That would be a great document. And then in so doing, we can also address if we're going to use multiple projects, let's figure out what the scope of those is and what the naming convention should be, so we don't end up with a mishmash like we have with open source.
Okay. Is Amit able to help in this too, Ben?
We've been discussing some more about the projects. We should be able to do that. I guess technically the quarter is also not over yet. We still have an objective for this quarter.
I see. Okay. No worries.
And then the other thing that we need to think about is criteria, rules for adding volunteers. Like, is anybody who shows up to this call going to get access to everything, or are we going to get very limited access? We may want to create secondary Google groups that, I mean, we've started this already with DNS, right? We need to create a bunch of individual groups for each individual topic and grant those groups the role access, those sorts of things. So we need some criteria for like who gets credentials to help.
I would also add to that we've recently had some issues again, and we've switched to having a group with write and a group with read.
Okay.
The group with read is a superset, and they can look at things and maybe help debug, but they can't actually write to the cluster.
Is that specific to testing, or do you think that actually is going to apply everywhere?
I think we might want it in more places because it's also a way to sort of like start onboarding people, like let them take a look at it, but not necessarily trust them with actually poking the buttons yet.
Right.
Okay. So again, I need a volunteer to write a page about the existing setup and how we should replicate it. Like, we've already created a DNS group. We could delete it and create a different one with a -read and -write names or whatever. What I don't want to do is start 10 efforts and then have to go back and retool 10 different times.
I don't think the read and write is as big or as interesting of a deal as how we decide who's going to have write.
I agree with that. So the biggest task I think in front of this group is actually making time to make progress on these things. Like we're putting aside an hour a week to meet, but if we can't get traction on these other action items, we'll be in the same spot a year from now, right?
Right. Yeah. We don't have to wait for the work group stuff to be done before we can make these kinds of decisions, right?
Agree with that. Like, I don't mean to volunteer people, but I thank Ben for signing up for writing a page on the project stuff. I need somebody to sit and write how, make a proposal for how do we add volunteers? Like, what are the rules?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that.
Yeah.
You fall on the grenade every time, man.
Well, I feel like that's almost part of the charter in some sense. One of the options I was using was the product security team as another option for another model for this group, because they have some level of vetting and requirements, right, before people are allowed to do it.
I would also add, we might actually want to include some of those same requirements. Like, something that's come up in the past for us is that there is some amount of CI for the security folks, and we want to keep that private for obvious reasons, but someone still has to run it. So they effectively have like the same level of access to what's going on with that team.
Yeah, and so I have experience running this sort of commingled requirement thing through in the context of the GitHub admin team. So I feel like there's some level of overlap with the charter, but I don't want us to get hung up on nailing down all the details of group policy and whatnot. I'm interested more in we should have some sort of lightweight process to vet responsible people.
Right.
And I think what I've been hearing Ben volunteer for is like, we have some experience doing things one way in test infra in the past. So we can recommend why we wouldn't suggest doing it that way. But I don't know if we're signing up for a full detail-oriented proposal on groups and credentials. But like, we can throw out a straw man and have this group iterate on it. I don't know
I'm happy to iterate. Like, honestly, we just need a starting point.
Right.
And I don't know what's been done in detail with SIG
Right.
testing or with the security groups. So if somebody knows those and tie them together, then that's fantastic. What I don't want to do is get stuck where we say, hey, we're going to create this utility cluster, but there's only 3 people that I trust. And the only reason I trust them is because I've known them for 4 years through the project, and new people are showing up. In particular, Dims, you introduced a couple new people this morning. Might be worthwhile for them to say hello, introduce themselves, tell us sort of who they work for, why are they interested in this sort of work, what they hope to achieve, those sorts of things.
I have a slot for them, Tim. Hang on.
Okay. All right. So anyway, that's the point. Is like I would like this to be a recognized process where it's not a bunch of people who know each other inviting a bunch of people that they know.
Understood. Yeah. The main reason for inviting Manjunath was his work around the registry and multiple architectures, manifest stuff, and he's been working on images for a while. So it would be good to have his input on how we can do the import process and things like that, right? So that's where I wanted to bring him into the discussion here. In terms of so right now, if you look at our Google containers, it has everything in there. How do we make sure? And the other flip side to that is the cluster API folks and the cloud provider folks don't have a home to push their images to. So I want to get to a point where we have some kind of rules around, okay, this is a registry that can be used for XYZ purpose. These are the images. These are the criteria for adding the images, and these are the people who could be pushing images to the specific.
So I would love to see somebody, again, driving a sort of a specification for how we want that to be. I know you've looked at the promoter proposal from our side.
Right.
And I think it's met with overall general approval. That's another big effort for us to start the migration of that over. If we want to try to impose some new structure as we sort of make the transition, like, I don't know if we should do it at the same time. I don't know if they're really orthogonal things, right?
Right. And so you touched on another important part. I want to spin off multiple efforts at the same time and get people going and not have to like, okay, we're going to finish DNS and then we're going to start something else.
So I agree with that, but I want to make sure we establish the norms and the rules and the conventions before we spin up too many parallel. There's the second part, which is like spinning up a new utility cluster and learning all that stuff doesn't require any access to the existing clusters.
Correct.
Which means anybody here could start doing that and come up with the rules for which projects do we put them in and how are we going to set up RBAC and how are we going to do namespaces and et cetera, and how we're going to do billing reports. To start the migration of the GCR stuff actually does require a level of access that only a handful of people have. Like, I don't even have access to it anymore. So we'll have to engage that carefully. I'm happy to hear about what structure people would like to see in there. I'm all for structure. That said, we can't actually abandon the previous convention, which was throw everything in the root. So we'll have to migrate over everything that we currently have and start to impose new structure. Do we do that at the same time? Do we do that as a second step?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So
from my perspective, this is also why I think DNS is one of the more important things to get done first, so that migrating different services to different clusters or whatever is a lot easier once it's really easy to flip DNS from one place to another. If we find out we've put a bunch of things in one cluster that actually belongs in different clusters or vice versa. Right.
That's a great point.
Manjunath, can you speak a little bit about the work you're doing currently?
Okay, yeah, I can do that. Say hey. Also, so myself, Manjunath. So I basically work for IBM India. So basically, in Kubernetes community, what I spend time mostly is so writing all the test images and the infra images, multi-architecture supporting all different platforms like ARM, ARM64, 364 really, and S390. So that's what the target we did. And in fact, we in 1.12, we released all the K8s images with supporting all these architectures with Fat Manifest. So yeah, so the future goal, what I'm trying to look at it is like, so a lot of tests in Kubernetes, at least in E2E node or whatever, right? So they are using their own repositories, and then we don't really have any sort of a control where those images are, and then we don't even know about the source of those images. If something goes wrong, it's very difficult to fix those images again. So what I'm trying to look at it is like, if any of these tests, what we have in our repository should have proper images supporting all the architectures, and then we should have at least the we should know how to fix if there are any issues or maintain those images properly, and then control them whenever we need the next version of or whatever kind of thing, right? So that's what I'm thinking of. And then and even what I was looking at recently is all these incubator projects. What we have, they're putting in their own repositories, right? So even that is not really great way of doing it. So I think if you have some sort of a image repositories created in GCR with certain certain naming convention, and then have some sort of a proper RBAC model to allow them to push or modify their own images, it'll be great, right? So currently, not a lot of people have any sort of access to push those images and manage. So all the time we are going to a couple of people, and then I know it is like XDY, like Jeff is helping us a lot, but again, like we should have a streamlined process there, and then with respect to managing these images and then updating them and whatever, right? So that's what I.
Are you volunteering, or tell me if I'm overstepping, are you volunteering to write a proposal for what you think the structure of the target repository should be?
Yep.
Yeah, sort of idealized state?
Yep.
Okay, because one of the things that we don't use, we don't take advantage of, is the fact that the repository within GCR can actually have an arbitrary number of directories, right? We don't need to have K8s.gcr.io/foo. You can have /foo bar bat baz quux as a big long path, and it will work just fine. We can establish a structure for those paths that represent our project structure better.
Yeah,
the one
exactly.
issue is, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem, go ahead. So I'm done.
I was gonna say, the one issue with using the folders, I don't think you can control access at a folder level. I think the access is only for the entire GCR project. So if you want
That's true. But if we use the promoter, then it doesn't really matter because humans don't have access to it. And we can, through the promoter manifest, we can actually include owner's metadata perhaps, and say like, hey, only, XD is the owner for the test sub-repository, but not for the DNS sub-repository. So if you try to push something to DNS, somebody who's reviewing that can say, hey, why do you have access to this?
Right.
Yeah, I think I have to spend some time understanding this stuff. So, yep.
Okay.
I don't know if it would be helpful also add like a year or so ago, and continuing internally at Google, we've done some auditing of the Google Containers group or the Google Containers GCR repo, just because there's so many images in there and trying to figure out like, where do some of these come from? What are their actual purposes, whatever. And I think there's no reason we can't share that. So I'll see if we can, at least get a copy of that shared, so that can at least be something to use. I know, like I tried to pull out all of the EDB images. So like, there's old versions of all the EDB images in Google Containers, but like the ones we currently use are in Kubernetes EDB test images, which has this like wider access. And sort of, I've been at least trying to pull things out of Google Containers that don't belong there, but yeah, I think this would be great to.
So I would like to go, I think I'd like to go the other direction and move everything into the K8s.gcr.io umbrella, because we've set up the auto regionalization of it. And so that's sort of going to be optimal for performance and cost.
Right.
And we can just use the structure and the promoter to govern access to it.
Yeah, and I think yeah, if we have proper access that way, that would be great. And as long as we also make sure that we I think, have a policy of somehow documenting where these images come from, or somehow have automation to tell that, because that's the other problem with a lot of stuff in Google containers right now is images that are 3 years old and I have no idea who built them, who uses them, where they came from.
So we won't be able to retrofit all that, but we'll be able to say, at least with the promoter, we'll have a track record of saying who promoted what image, and hopefully the PRs, we can establish the structure around the PRs there to say, where did this come from? What is the expected checksum, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah, I think Google Docker Images supports a lot of this metadata, so we can feed those metadata. I was looking at it, so probably if you have certain proper metadata into Docker Images, so that can be done like a Git commit or any of those SHA and then author, and many of those labels are supported. So if you deal with proper data and metadata into it, so I think we are good. So I think, yes, let me work on that part.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for volunteering. I hope I didn't foist that on you.
And you should work with the person who's doing the promoter stuff. Who's that again? I forgot.
Javier.
Javier. Okay.
I'll
Yeah, just ping me his ID. Yeah.
Are you in the K8s Test Infra, or not K8s Test Infra, the K8s Infra Slack?
Yeah, MKUMATG.
Yeah. Okay, I'll send that to you. I know you.
Cool.
So yeah, then bugged you so many times.
On the topic of getting DNS done as a gateway to other things, there are still some AIs needed to get DNS done. I still need some help chasing down owners for every name. I've spent some time this morning and this week retooling my personal work in progress repo to be ready to move under K8s.io. Hopefully I'll send a PR out this morning. But there's a bunch of to-dos. And those to-dos include finding owners for all of the URLs, all of the names that we have listed, and investigating whether we need to actually port all of them forward. And ideally writing a script that would do the dry run to a test domain, and then if that passes, push it to the real domain. I've included instructions in the README now on how to run OctoDNS sort of as you with your own credentials. So anybody who's in the K8s DNS Google group should be able to run it themselves now against the config that's checked in there. I tested it as my own Gmail. I added myself and removed myself. And that should work fine. It would be great if somebody would confirm that. Until we have a cluster up that we can run the automation in, I think it's acceptable to just say, here are the instructions, sort of like we do today with the website, Jeff. Like people push a PR and then we manually update it. We could limp along with that for a while. I think the instructions work, but it would be nice. The same way for the website, we have a test.sh, which actually runs through all the URLs and makes sure that they still work. I would really like a first do a dry run, then push to a canary, run a test against all of the name resolution against that canary, and then push to reality. And it's on my plate. I'll do it eventually, but if we're blocking behind DNS, I could use help.
Yeah, I think you have a volunteer, hippie hacker.
You know where the repo is? GitHub.com, Thokin, work in progress. It's linked in the doc somewhere.
Yeah, it's there in the doc under Friday, September 14th. You good, hippie hacker? Okay, thank you. And
I'll push a new push this morning with an updated README, and I'll change it from .text to a .md. With this push, I want to then make a PR against K8s.io to introduce the new subdirectory.
Awesome. And then that brings us to Nader. Hi, Nader. Do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi. I work for the Scale Factory. We're an AWS partner in the UK. I'm currently working on cluster API work, and I think we'll be looking for a home for the artifacts that we produce. Also, from a SIG cluster lifecycle perspective, we probably want to improve the way that we're doing the RPM and deb generation, particularly separating out the repositories where release candidates go, making sure that people who do automatic updates on systems can reliably trust that it's not going to break their clusters, essentially. I have started a proposal that might sort out for repository structure, and then also using like best practice specs for RPM and the equivalent for Debian. I'll probably have it ready for next week, to be honest.
So Nadir, did you go through the specs that are in K release and the ones in the KK repository?
I looked at them. I think last time I looked at them was about 6 months ago, so I need to revisit them.
Yeah,
I
think one of the first items that we've been talking about is like try to figure out a way to consolidate those two. There are spec files in both, and the release infrastructure uses the ones in K release to actually make the release. But then people are always, forgetting to sync between the two.
Yeah, I did that myself. But like the last time I tried to use it, I kept up on that as well. So it's definitely confusing for new people.
Right. So that would be on the side of the specs, right? But then on the side of where we need to upload them, or the directory structure that we need to upload it to, we had one problem during this release cycle where we pushed what was it, RC1, and that actually went to the stable directory.
Yeah.
And we broke a bunch of people for a day. Do you have like best practices of how the stable, experimental, nightly, that kind of repository structure should be set up?
Yeah, I'm going to put that in, and I think probably we want the per version repos so people can do their yum updates during the patch release and get upgraded, but then have something as part of their kubeadm or cluster API lifecycle to change between versions.
And do you work with both Yum and Deb, or just one of the two? Because I'm like lost in Yum.
So we're technically a CentOS shop, but some people in our team, I believe, might even be Debian maintainers of some sort. So we should be able to cover both.
Interesting. Awesome. Thank you. So who would be able to give some information, Tim, about how we have our directory structure for the images? I know that I can build the images by myself, but I don't know how it gets pushed out or where it gets pushed out to, or how the directory structure looks.
This is for Kubernetes release in particular?
Yes.
Yeah. I have not touched the release process in like 8 releases. The release team process has been great for me. So I would actually defer to somebody on SIG release.
Okay.
So this is usually where I would invoke Caleb Miles' name, but I don't know if he's got the bandwidth for this or not. Jeff, do you know of anybody who would be a more suitable candidate?
That's probably the best, especially for devs and RPM stuff. I feel like Caleb probably has the most context here, but yeah, he also,
like, I suspect you might get punted to somebody else, but Caleb would probably be the person to start with.
Okay. So let's do this then. For this one, let's do the write-up that you're doing, Nadir, and then we'll try to set up some time with Caleb and get his thoughts and trade-offs that he has seen before, and go from there.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
I think the other person who's sort of owned some of the RPM and Deb stuff in the distant past was Mike Denise, although I think he set up stuff and maintained it for a while and then has not worked on it in a long time. And so
he hasn't touched it in forever.
I think that's one of the reasons why, for example, like all of the Debs, for Ubuntu, we haven't updated to Bionic because basically nobody has touched it or maintained it in years. So
exactly,
he might have some context on how things were originally set up, maybe if he remembers, but he's not a current maintainer by any means.
Okay. Let's start with Caleb then, and then I'm sure he'll delegate after giving us some initial idea. What else do we have? Anybody wanted to talk about anything else?
So
Yeah.
for me, I'd like to regroup. Ideally, when we regroup in 2 weeks, to have a real DNS repo up and be having a conversation about how and when to actually make the flip.
Okay. And everybody has something to do between now and then, right? We don't have to have one more meeting in between. Nadir, you have something. Manjunath, you have something. I have some action items, and Hippie Hacker has one at least. Okay. I think we are all set here, unless anybody else has anything else.
Just add one thing. So we've been talking about Google related stuff. We will probably also need AWS bits, especially for SIG plus life cycle, because we're currently working on a AWS provider stuff.
You're talking about the container images, right?
Yeah, and even CI and all that kind of stuff. Is this the venue where this stuff will...
Oh, we can do that
yes.
in, sorry.
Yes, but no. I would punt on that for now and come talk to SIG testing if you have specific concerns there. Loosely speaking, we have AWS credentials that are given to us by CNCF. So like if you want to create a new job that does a new thing in AWS, you can totally just file a PR that does that today. I've had people from AWS ask if that's how they can create more jobs. So come talk to us.
Okay, all set?
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Happy Friday/Saturday for you future dwellers.
Tomorrow's going to be a beautiful day. I can tell you.